Welcome to Best Decision Ever, where we believe that life comes down to very few moments and decisions. So on this show, we highlight the very people that have had the courage to overcome fear and make the decision to start that business, begin writing that blog, or just stand up for what they believe in. And on this show, we know that success is only one part of the story. So we take the time to dive into the challenges that these people have had to endure in order to get to their current point of success. So we can take the routines and mindsets and apply them to our own lives. For those of you who are new, my name is John, and I'm your host. I think of myself as a performance enthusiast. I love sitting down with people who are at the top of their game and learn from them so I can take those lessons and apply it to my life. And today, we have a very, very, very special guest. He's known widely as someone that lived in his Honda Civic for 3 months to raise money for his first startup, Grasswire, which eventually failed, and thereafter he was told by an investor that his skills were not marketable. Despite all this, he had the courage to write his book on growing startups called Secret Sauce, which raised $120,000 on Kickstarter. He then used those funds to start what was known as Lambda School, which is today known as Bloom Tech. To date, it has raised over $100 million in venture capital, and it has transformed the way that we look at higher education. Without further ado, I bring you Austin Allred. Thank you so much for coming on the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
This is so awesome. I'm obviously stoked, as you can see. So, let's just dive into it. There's so many topics to touch on. First off, what is, and again, as I told you before we started the cameras, I might call it Lambda School, Bloom Tech, but either or. What is the purpose of Bloom Tech? Why does it exist, and why is it so important?
Yeah, so our purpose in life is to help people find the right role in their career and help increase their incomes. We think there's a fundamentally missing piece of capitalism, and that is, if you look at the world of, there are a bunch of employers and there are a bunch of employees, the way that people find their way into their life work is pretty haphazard. I don't know if you're like me. I took a personality test in high school, and it told me I should be a truck driver, and that's the only guidance I've ever had.
Oh God!
Actually, would love being a truck driver. Wouldn't pay as well.
So it was right.
Yeah, it wasn't totally wrong. But yeah, I think on average, human capital, human labor, people working is probably the most unoptimized asset class that there is. And people get mad at me when I call it an asset class, but I say that because you can trade pork bellies by the 1,000 tons in real time at a Bloomberg terminal. But if you have someone over here who could be a software engineer, and there's a company over there that would love to hire software engineers, there's really nothing helping connect those. So yeah, we describe Bloom Tech as we try to create life-changing increases in income in less than a year.
Okay. So for you, it's about really, it sounds like creating almost a level playing field, and giving people opportunities who to get into tech who maybe wouldn't have as much of a chance to either have as high-paying jobs or just be able to get that type of training that you guys offer.
Yeah, it's really. There's a lot of things that go into it, but at the end of the day, what we're really trying to produce is kind of a market equilibrium where, if you look at a company, right, and you say, what do you need? And they say, oh, we need X, Y, Z, and we can't find it. And then you draw a 50-mile radius around that company. How many people would be able to do those roles if they had the right training, the right inputs? Probably a lot. And how many of those people are very underemployed? Probably a lot. And so it's just, really we're helping unlock potential of people, helping them do what they would be best at, help them make as much money as they can or should. And right now, if you're, working a minimum wage job, there's nobody that's going to come to you and say, hey, by the way, you could be making 4X over here if you would do this. And that's not just, from minimum wage to higher wage. That's probably true at almost every company. I mean, if you think about 10 people, how many of them, think of your friends, how many of them have maximized their income, or, they've really sought out everything they can in their career? Probably a small number. And so that's what we're trying to fix.
Yeah, it sounds like really allowing people, at least in my words, to reach their potential. I'm someone that's driven by helping people to reach their potential, and that really resonates and grabs me. I'd love to hear a little bit more about like life before what was then called Lambda School. How you felt this problem yourself, and how you even got to living into a Honda Civic. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah. So I mean, when I was in college, first of all, I was super bored. It just was not the right fit for me. And I'd done a lot of, I lived in Ukraine for a couple of years. I lived in China for a while. I had a sense of where I wanted to go. And I knew I wanted to work in tech.
Okay.
And there's a little bit of a startup-y community in Provo. But it wasn't, it's bigger today. And it just was not Silicon Valley. And so I had heard when I was like 16, I went to go watch an astronaut speak because I was really into space. And his advice was, when you know what you want to do, just figure out how to get into the dead center of it, the absolute most exciting part, and just get there and figure it out. And so I was thinking about that, talking with one of my roommates, and like, man, I would love to move to, I'm reading all of the blogs. I'm reading at the time TechCrunch and Hacker News. I think they may be moderately less relevant today. But yeah, I just felt like I needed to get out there. At the same time, I had basically no money. I had a Honda Civic. I just decided that I was going to go figure it out. And I read a blog of a guy, I can't even remember his last name, but who had lived in Silicon Valley in his Honda Civic. And I realized that I had the exact same car as him, literally a 2-door Honda Civic. I think I bought it for like $4,000 or something like that.
It's like 1 month of rent here.
Yeah, no, at the time it was a little less, but it was still, I was looking around and the cheapest room I could find was like $800. And I was like, that's, at the time that's what I made in a month, so it just wasn't an option. I'd read a bunch of Thoreau, and when I was in China, I was living in hostels, and I was pretty comfortable without, living a very minimalist lifestyle. So I was like, all right, I'll just go. I'd never slept in my car until I showed up in Palo Alto and like parked on the street. And I was like, all right, let's figure this out. But yeah, I decided to just go be there. Mm-hmm. And I think I had like $300 to my name, no job. I had a little MacBook. I found like a co-working space that was open during the day, and I just drove and said, I'm going to figure it out later. And it worked out, but it was a little crazy in the meantime.
And what was it like the first night in that car, just like trying to get your stuff together? So I think, and I asked that because a lot of people are afraid to take that first step to go, and whether it's start that company or begin writing a blog they're passionate about, and like that's kind of your first step in essence, right? That first night in that
yes.
car. What was it like? Absolutely
terrifying is the short answer. So the way you do it is you kind of lay down the passenger seat, and it gets flat-ish, and then you lay down the back row, and then your feet kind of go toward the back of the trunk, or the tail end of the car. Mm-hmm. And then there's a bunch of it's not a totally flat surface, so you take an air mattress, you blow it up kind of halfway so it covers up all the springs and all the bumps. And then I just had a sleeping bag on top of that. So you get down in there, and you can't really see out the windows. You're laying down. I didn't realize this at the time, but when the sun comes up in the summer at about 6:30 a.m., it gets hot really, really fast. So I pulled into Palo Alto at I'd been driving from Utah, so it was like 12-hour drive. So I pulled in 11 or 12 o'clock. I was like, yeah, I'll just sleep here until I wake up. And then about 5:30, the sun starts to come up, and the car's 80 degrees like that. And I was like, oh my gosh. But yeah, the first night I was like, I didn't plan a place to park. I was like, I'll just figure it out. So I was driving around the neighborhoods, where's a quiet-ish place where I won't be in a busy area. So, I don't even know what the laws are. Will the police stop me? Will people see me and freak out? And I, have no idea where I ended up. It was just some random neighborhood in Palo Alto, and just a spot looked dark-ish. Turns out there's still street lights, and it's not really dark, and that kind of sucked. And then, and then you're laying there, you know, with your head kind of in the passenger seat, and you see people walking by, because you can still see kind of through the angle, through the car window, and any of them could like look at you and be like, "What the hell is this?" I was just terrified that someone's going to call the cops on me, and that happened a couple times, but not for a while. And you realize that like most people are just going about their day. They don't care about you. They don't think about you. They're not, they're not looking into car windows, looking down and seeing what's there. You walk past a car and you don't think about it. Eventually, I started sleeping in a church parking lot that I knew was vacant. And that calmed things down a little bit. But yeah, short answer is it was a little bit terrifying.
Yeah, and obviously it worked out. But yeah, it's just it's an amazing story. You just be able just to dive in and deal with the fear of doing that, and then keep going. I think you had a similar. It sounds like you kind of had a similar willingness just to dive in when I believe, and correct me if I'm wrong, but when Grasswire ended is when you started to write. You had a blog that you wrote about essentially just growing a startup, and then you turned it into what is now called Secret Sauce, your first book. What was that process like of leaving that startup and then deciding, hey, you know what, instead of getting XYZ tech job, I'm going to go write this book and make money that way? What was that like?
Yeah, that was one of the most surreal experiences of my life. Okay. Because so after Grasswire wound down, we had a couple of contractors that like we were, I won't go deep into the story of Grasswire, but we had our next round lined up. We had documents signed. We were waiting for a wire. And then the would-be lead investor just said, yeah, I'm not going to send a wire, which I didn't realize happened. It's still pretty rare, but I've heard it happening a few times. But in my mind, if like there's the risk that they're not going to send the money, but we'd done due diligence. I'd had lawyers working on documents for a month. Like I didn't realize that was a real risk. So we were just out of money. And he had his assistant call on, I believe it was December 20th, and like, hey, we're just not going to invest. And no explanation, no nothing, just, yeah, we're out. And like, we were done. That was it. So I called the entire company that night, laid everybody off on December 20th. No severance because there was no money. And we had a couple of contractors that their payroll hadn't hit yet. And so I paid them out of pocket. And so I was like, yeah, I had $0. And I ended up working for a tech company in San Francisco. And while I was working there, I found I could save, or I could pay down about $2,000 of the debt per month. So I'd done that for 5 or 6 months, and it was I think $5,000 left. But that was like, that weighed on me. Like I would think about that $2,000 night and day, and I felt powerless to do anything about it. And I was a little mentally wrecked from the company failing. Like right after the company failed, I remember driving by like a golf course and watching a guy pick up golf balls and being like, maybe I could do that. I might not fail at that. I just felt like complete failure. Like there's no other way to describe it. And so I was like, I need to get out of this debt. And I was kind of just brainstorming with my wife about like, how could, we don't have anything to sell. We didn't have anything. Our daughter had been in the hospital, and so that like delayed the paying it off even more. And I was like, you know what, and my mom was a book editor for a really small publisher. And she'd written a few books, and I mean, publishing books through traditional publishers is just not a great money-making enterprise. And she spent forever writing, it was probably thousands of hours, and she probably made a couple $1,000s per book, Some of them now have done a little better, but it's not it's not tech money, to say the least. But I was like, you know what? I bet if I price it right, like I know how to acquire users. I know how to teach people to acquire users. And I'd written a few blog posts that had gone really viral and had millions of views. And I had a couple thousand people on an email list that were waiting for my next stuff to come out. And so I was talking to a friend, another kind of, I don't love the term growth hacker, but in all of our testing, it performed way better than anything else that we could call the book. So we said that it was about growth hacking. And I was like, look, the two of us together could probably bring in, a couple hundred sales of this book at $40 a piece. Let's price it high because it's a business expense. If it actually helps you and your company, what's $40? And let's throw it out there and see what happens. And so we spent a couple of months. I only had the first 3 chapters, but kind of seeding our list and doing all this work and testing the landing pages. We had all these viral loops, like all the tricks in the book. And then we're like, all right, we're gonna throw it on Kickstarter. And I took the day off work, and he was from London, but he flew out here to San Francisco. And we met up at his crappy Airbnb in like, I think it was in the Tenderloin actually. And we just sat there and like we hit, all right, we're going to turn it on. And within 30 seconds, we'd hit $5,000 in sales. Like it was instant. And that was a turning point for me because I was like, oh my gosh, I had been like, yeah, it was a lot of work up until that point. But I've been stressed, and that was my goal, right? If we could hit $5,000, we'll split it 50-50. I can pay off my debt, and like by the end of the month, I'm done. And I was like, this is the most incredible thing that's ever happened to me. And so I was like, yeah, let's go celebrate. We went to lunch, we came back, and it was like at $20,000. And I think by the end of the day, we'd hit $50,000 or $60,000, which, I mean, that was like half of what I'd make in a year, So that was when I realized for the first time, like, oh, if you create something that people really want, it can work really well. And I realized that I had been so like mentally bottling what I thought I was capable of because I felt like a failure, and I was optimizing to not fail instead of optimizing to potentially succeed. And that was like the first taste of like, oh my gosh, I can just create something, and if people want it, then that's great, and they'll pay for it, which was new because my first company was very much pre-revenue, and it was one of those, well, once it gets really big, we'll layer on advertising, and it never gets even a fraction of the size that you would need to get to. So yeah, that was a life-changing experience for me.
It sounds like it, and it sounds like, as you mentioned, you really capped yourself on what you thought was possible. You were optimizing for not making mistakes, and I think a lot of people get stuck there. I've even seen myself get stuck there. What did you do to get yourself mentally out of that? Because that is a hard hole to come out of like, oh, you know what? I should avoid risks. I should avoid taking that chance. How did you get yourself out of that?
The honest answer is I listened to a lot of Jay-Z and Kanye West, and then I tried that Kickstarter that went really well. Like, I still wonder what would have happened if it didn't sell, right? Like, maybe I'd used the wrong marketing messaging, or I'd created a product that didn't have product market fit and it went nowhere. I could still be like a, senior marketing manager somewhere, which isn't a bad career path at all. It would have been fine. But yeah, like when that first day, I remember calling my wife and just being like, yeah, maybe, and you can tell that my wife acts as my therapist sometimes, but like, maybe I can do this again. Like maybe there is something more than just taking a salary and like hoping that equity hits at some point. Like, and the first, when we started what was then Lambda School, for the first year, if I'm being honest, I was optimizing to make sure that I would never have to go work a job again. That's all I cared about. So I didn't care if it was a giant company. I didn't care if it was, I just wanted to never be in that position again. And that was still unhealthy, right? Like I was still playing not to lose instead of playing to win. And so, it takes a while to get out of that. And it's just, one step and one small win at a time, I guess. But, and that's still a battle we fight today where, hey, are we optimizing to make sure we have enough runway? Which you obviously have to do, or are we optimizing to make sure that we can accomplish the mission that we all have? And depending on which one of those you're looking at, and as a founder, you have to bounce back and forth, because you can't run out of runway, but you also need to be thinking about the future. I think it's actually really important in the long run to play to win instead of play not to lose.
Yeah, and what would you say to someone who just heard what you said, and is like, wow, I am playing to lose right now, and I don't quite know how to change that mindset? What would you say to them?
I mean, it's one of those things where it's a little bit easy to say in retrospect, but I was so worried about things happening that probably wouldn't have even been that bad. Like, I would go to work every day and be like, oh my gosh, what if they fire me? What if they fire me? And, my performance reviews were great. I was getting promoted, if anything, but I think who is it? Marcus Aurelius that says you can suffer twice, and you end up, you can suffer for a lot of things that will never come to pass. So maybe just let yourself suffer once. Obviously said it far more elegantly, even after the translation. But yeah, like the mental model I have now is I actually go through, just once, like a worst case scenario exercise, right? So worst case scenario right now, company runs out of money, have to lay off hundreds of people. A lot of stuff that we could have done, we're not going to be able to do. All of the work goes to zero. And then I would wake up the next morning and I would eat breakfast with my wife and kids and figure out what to do next. I'm no longer in a place where I need a paycheck coming in 30 days later. I know I could get a great job. I could probably raise another round if I wanted to. And you want to do that once, right? You want to know what the downside looks like, just because then it's not scary. I've lived in a car. I've literally lived off of refried beans and tortillas for a couple of months, and it sucked, but you'll get through it, And between where I am now and there are actually 100 contingencies. There are a million things that could pick up or work out or whatever, and even talking about how in the early days I was playing to not lose. I had intentionally built the company in such a way that if everybody else had to leave and if I were the only person there making no salary, that I could keep it going for a couple of years just to not let the dream die. So now I think we're probably still in a place where even if everything went to zero, I wouldn't technically have to shut the company down. I would just not pay myself and I'd live on my savings and we'd keep going. And that, I'm very conservative in that way, and it doesn't make sense to live like that necessarily. But then that allows me to say, okay, now I don't have to worry about that anymore. Mm-hmm. Now, I need to figure out how to raise money the right way and structure the team the right way and build the right product so that we can accomplish the mission. And so, I actually do think it's your job to consider what the worst case scenario is. And I find that it's often better to actually think through what is the worst that could happen than to just worry about bad things happening. Mm-hmm. Because if you realize, well, the absolute worst thing that could happen, that doesn't really scare me, then nothing else on top of that will scare you either. And then you don't have to live in fear. You can just try things. And if you fail, it's all right. I mean, especially in Silicon Valley, like, Silicon Valley has got to be the most forgiving place with regard to failure ever. I mean, I was talking about a company, and I won't name names, that was just had burned through a ton of money very quickly. Thought they were going to raise the next round, straight into the wall. Everybody's laid off. And I was talking to somebody that was like, well, surely that founder's never going to be able to raise money in Silicon Valley again, because they burned way too much, they grew way too big. And I was like, I guarantee you they will. Like, it may be, they're not going to be able to raise $100 million as quickly as they did last time, but could they go start another company and get a pre-seed round? Totally. And there's like, you can look at that as a negative, but I think by and large, if you're thinking about starting a company in Silicon Valley or in tech, I've never seen that not push someone's career forward even faster than it would if they didn't start a company. Mm-hmm. So I don't know, I think about risk and downside risk a lot, because that's what we try to build at the school, is a way, if there is no downside risk, if there is no downside scenario, then you can just go big. And that's what I think Silicon Valley has created, and I hope that that's what Bloom Tech has created or is creating.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like for you is with the big things, taking time to iron it out. What does the worst case look like? And then really realizing, one, it's not that bad, and then two, there's a really only upside for taking action.
Yeah, and then spend time really visualizing and imagining what the upside scenario looks like. So I'm a big believer in, and I talk about this with our students, until you really understand and like can at least imagine and think through what it would look like, what it would feel like, when you reach the goal, whatever goal it is that you have. I find that when I really, really think through what that would be like, it's a lot easier to connect the dots between where you are now and there than if you're just like, I'm going in this general direction.
Yeah. So it sounds like for you getting really clear and almost giving yourself 5 minutes to really like feel it, think about it, visualize. Yeah. Right. With that said, how did you, going back to that time then when you called your wife and you're like, hey, I think I can really do this, how did you take that momentum and start Lambda School? Like, what did that transition look like from your current job to then going to Lambda, to starting Lambda School, and then obviously, product market fit, then scaling it?
Yeah, so I was still working full time, and I had a long commute, and I was still at a startup, so I was still pretty long hours, honestly. But I realized there are a couple of things that made me really excited about that experience. The first was there were people who bought the book, who read it, who applied that to their business, and they'd email me and say like, "Oh my gosh, this changed everything," and that was really interesting to me because I didn't have to feel bad about charging those people money. I could have charged them 5 times that, and they would have been thrilled. At the same time, there were, of the people that bought the book, something like 50% even downloaded it, right? So, and that's just, the information business utilization is really hard, and so I felt weird about, obviously it's on them to read the book, but I was talking to one of my buddies and like, hey, my thing is kind of growth and programming, but yours is like hardcore programming. Let's put together a Haskell course and let's put that on Kickstarter, because I can just use the same playbook and rinse and repeat again. Mm-hmm. And he was really into a programming language called Haskell that he had convinced me to start building everything in. And it uses something called the Lambda calculus as the main feature of it. And I was like, well, yeah, we'll just call it Lambda School, and we'll put together a quick course. Neither of us had ever taught anything before, but The Haskell community was so small and so tight knit that I knew that if you built a Haskell course, all of them would buy it, if for no other reason than, like, it's, I don't want to say it's cult-like, but like the Haskell community is very, very tight knit. And so we did just that, and people bought it. And I think, we ended up splitting like $10,000. So it wasn't a big, we charged $100 for like a video, the equivalent of something that would be on Udemy or Teachable or whatever. Just, him walking through setting up, your GCI and, building your first semi app in Haskell. That was it. But people were like, oh, this is awesome. And then talking with that same friend, I was like, this is cool, but the difference for me between the book and the Haskell course was the Haskell people were kind of doing it for fun, and the people who were buying the book were doing it like it was the means to the end, and the end was making more money, having a better business. It was doing something more than just a skill that you could probably figure out. Like it was so tangible. And I was like, I hate to say this because there are 80 million different learn to code, programs and courses and boot camps, but like, let's just build one for like, 0 to 1. And so we started teaching free classes to kind of just drum up interest. And we started talking to all the people who signed up and like, hey, what is it that you like want? Do you want a book? Do you want a pre-recorded, lesson that you can access on your own? And everybody was like, no, that like books are already there. I can buy a set of lectures, but like what's cool about this is I can either like move somewhere and go to a code boot camp, or you guys are just doing this online. And this is, Slack was coming on the scene. Zoom was brand new at the time. So it was the first time you really could do something really interactive without having to build your own. I mean, the companies before us are like, yeah, we're going to teach people to code online. You have to build your own platform from ground zero and like figure out how to do video conferencing. And that's just hard.
Yeah.
So like, okay, well, let's just like teach people to code on Slack and Zoom. Like, how much would you pay for this? They're like, yeah, we pay what we pay the other code boot camps. You're a code boot camp. I was like, I don't really want to be a code boot camp because I don't want to hire out of code boot camps because I think the curriculum is broken and it's not long enough, all this stuff. But everybody's like, look, you're the only place that I can go without moving. I was like, oh, that's interesting. And so he said, okay, well, my co-founder had taught at a code boot camp before, so he knew what all the, curriculum needed to be and how all that worked. He says, okay, you just want a code boot camp on the internet? And everyone was like, yeah, that's it. It's like, okay, well, you'll pay us $10,000. And a bunch of people were like, yeah, we'll pay you $10,000. I was like, oh, wow, that's, so we started doing the math and realized if we train 100 people a year, $10,000 each, it's $1 million. If we don't hire anybody, we just split that two ways. We'll each take home $500,000. I think we might have started with 50. Like, if we train, 12, 13 people, every 3 months, we have a super small code boot camp with like a very, it's just us and a handful of people. I can get 50 people to pay for that. And then we each take home $250,000 a year. That's it. And that was the entire plan. So our first cohort, right before I quit my job, it had like 15 people in it. They all paid us $10,000. We were trying to figure out how to do something longer because 3 months is just not enough. Yeah. And so we told everybody that joined, like, hey, you're going to want to spend a couple months before, really working on this pre-course work because we're going to start at a really high level and keep going. And then we kept getting all these emails from people being like, oh, I'd love to join, but I just don't have the money. And I was like, yeah, that makes, you're here to learn to code so that you can make enough money to like, change your life. Like it makes sense that you don't have money. And my day job at the time was working in growth at a lending company. So I was so used to thinking about credit risk and had spent a ton of time with the capital markets team. So I understood, in fine-grained detail how the back end of risk management and capital markets and stuff worked. And so I was just like playing with some math and like, well, what if we just charged, it's just the two of us. What if we charged $1,000 up front? And then if you get a job on the other side, you pay us either the remainder of the tuition or we change the tuition price because, we're taking some risk. Maybe that's fair. And, money's not coming till later. Maybe that's fair. And the price is totally arbitrary anyway. So we said, all right, next cohort. And that was when we're like, and this is our chance to say, we're going to teach you what you actually need to know. And we modeled out the curriculum like it actually needs to be 6 months. Like 3 months is awesome. You can do it 4 times a year. It really should be 6 months. And I had the money left over from the book sales I hadn't touched any of other than to pay off debt. I was like, worst case scenario, we can live off of that for a little while. So let's just try $1,000 up front. So we had an email list of a couple thousand people, and we emailed the email list and said, hey, if you want to pay $1,000 up front, we'll cover the rest until you get hired. And I think there were like 200 people that were like, that's amazing, I'm in. I was like, wait a minute, that's like, that is 10 times as many people as we would have had otherwise. So if we get all those people, we just 10x our revenue if we can help everybody get a job. And then we started talking to just kept talking to the users and, hey, what are we still lacking? What's interesting? What's not? And there are a bunch of people that are like, yeah, I don't even have $1,000, man. Like that's, making $30,000 a year, working at a gas station, $1,000 is hard to come by. Mm-hmm. And I was reading a bunch of essays by Milton Friedman from like the 70s talking about income. He didn't call them income share agreements at the time, but why don't schools train you in exchange for a percentage of your income for some set period of time? And so I threw that out to people, and they're like, "Oh, that sounds amazing." And I was like, "What if we did it $0 up front and 17% of your income for a couple of years?" Like, oh, that's a little bit high, but we're only going to take it if you make more than, let's say, $50,000 a year. They're like, oh, that's a no-brainer. Like, I'm in. And they're like, well, what if I get a super high-paying job? What if it's I get paid $200,000? You're going to take what is that? 34 times 2. I'm going to pay you $68,000. I was like, yeah, that's too high. Let's cap it at 30. And everybody was like, we're in. Like, thousands of people were like, yeah, we're in. Wow. I was like, okay, shoot. So then I started talking to other schools, and I was like, hey, so, we're thinking of running this experiment where it's online, and everybody's like, don't do anything online. Like, online instruction doesn't work. We tried it. I was like, well, how did you do it? And they're like, yeah, we recorded everything. We put it on, so that you could access it whenever you wanted, and said, see you in 3 months, and nobody finished it. I was like, well, it's totally different than your experience in person, right? Like, you're just giving them a MOOC, basically, and they're not finishing. They're like, yeah, it just doesn't work. I was like, okay. So I don't know what the right experience is, but I still think there's a way to do it that's not that.
It's not that, yeah.
And then I was like, and I'm thinking of making it $0 up front. No cash out of pocket. And people are like, that's the worst idea we have ever heard. I was like, tell me more. Like, why is that the case? I'm like, well, the only way that you can help somebody get a job is if they're very, very motivated and very, very dedicated. And the only way that you know if they're motivated or dedicated is if they write you a check. And I was like, well, what if they either don't have the money or are just a little bit they're just not certain that they'll get a job, and so they're trying to hedge their bets, mm-hmm. right? Like the Code Bootcamp loan is a relatively expensive loan, and if you're making a small income, it can be like life-altering. Not to mention, universities and student debt and all that stuff.
And thinking about that too, it seems like just from watching other interviews and just listening to you talk about the business and like where you're taking it, I've been really impressed with just outside looking in, like how much you know about not only about like coding, but just like educational curriculum, like politics, education, right? You've almost had to like evolve as your business has evolved. Like my first question with that in mind is like, how do you do that? Like, how do you get yourself to continually learn, grow, evolve as your business needs? It's almost like you're continually meeting the needs of the business as you grow and scale. How do you do that?
Yeah, I mean, being a founder is a practice of learning as much as you can as quickly as you can so that you can hire the person who's an expert and then continue to learn from them. So one of the co-founders, his name is Caleb, is an instructional design, like world-class expert. You know, he was working at Apple building their Everyone Can Code program. But we call him a co-founder. He wasn't there on day one. We hired him shortly after we started because I was like, wow, this is, in my mind, I was like, well, an engineer is like, you really want to learn from someone who's the best engineer. And whether or not they're a good teacher, like, yeah, it's a nice to have. And pretty quickly realize, oh, it's actually the complete opposite, right? Like, you can imagine like being a piano teacher, right? Like, you can be the best piano teacher in the world and be completely miserable at teaching someone to just get started playing the piano. And it's the same in coding. So I go find the 5 smartest people that I can talk to. I sit down with each of them for half an hour, an hour. I think I think Paul Graham referred to this as like what Brian Chesky does, the best in the world. So I kind of stole from him. And it helps when, you know, you get to enough of a status or a position that you can just, those people take your meetings, right? But yeah, you go find who you think are the 5 best people in the world at a thing, and they're all incredibly busy. So some of them will meet with you, some of them won't meet with you. You have a very specific set of questions because you don't want to waste those people's time. And then I go buy like 15 books on Amazon and I read them all simultaneously. And so at any given time, if there's a topic that I'm interested in, I have like, my house, I try to do ebooks because I'm a crazy minimalist when it comes to living, and I don't like gathering things. But yeah, I'll be reading everything that I can find, and I'll just swim in it for as long as I need to. And then usually I'll hire somebody that is really good at that, and then keep learning from them. So yeah, I mean, that was, you know, in the early days, that was capital markets and risk management, instructional design, securitization, and then it became, you know, product, gamification, standardized tests, hiring, mechanics, how HR, like there's just so many things that you have to know, not just a little bit, you have to know them inside and out. You have to know, you know, when our partnerships team goes out, do they want to talk to the engineering manager or the head of HR or the recruiter? And what are the different tactics you would take if you were trying to sell to each of those people? Like, I couldn't have guessed at that when we were first getting started, but you have to know that in the long run. Even if you're not doing it day to day, you have to be able to look at it and see if something is wrong. And over time, I've developed a kind of a bias in hiring where I don't like hiring anybody who can't get their hands dirty. So once you get to a certain scale, there are people that you hire them and they see their job is to hire the 7 people beneath them that can actually do the work. I don't hire anybody that couldn't dig in and do the work themselves. So we say that we only hire player coaches, not just coaches. It took me a while to get there, but I think there's just something so important about being able to, you know, be on the factory floor, so to speak, and actually be able to look at a thing and know what's broken, and know what it takes to fix it. That it's just such an important part of running a company.
And you know, something along the way that I've noticed that I think is important to touch on is that you've been able to deal with a lot as the company has grown, and obviously as you've grown your skill sets and the company continues to get bigger and bigger. You know, it's just like being able to take some criticism. I think a lot of people are afraid to go out and do something different, like you've done, and then handle just being like you're pretty outspoken about the current education industry, and it's just being able to handle criticism. How do you handle that, and just people having different views, and like as you continue to talk about what you're doing as the company continues to grow?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny because in the very early days, there is no criticism, right? Everyone's like, oh my, it's like, you don't look at like a little seedling and be like, you crappy tree, It's like, yeah, of course it's crappy. It's a seedling. But then as you start to grow, I think we got to, like, things were working so well in the early days, and the success stories were so wild that even like, one of our first students ever was like literally working in a factory, single dad, African American, jumped straight to $80,000 a year, like completely life-changing, life-altering trajectory. And like word of that started getting around Silicon Valley, and it got to the point where there was just so much incredible like hype. And I mean, everybody that I talked to was like, we're talking about you guys, and how, like my employees would make fun of me because every time we would go to dinner, we'd walk down the street and someone would want to take a picture. It's like hard to, and I definitely don't say that to boast, I don't care, but it was at such a level of like, when I was a small investor in a company called Clubhouse, and they went through the same, probably even, definitely greater extent of just like everybody is talking about you and thinking about you in their article. Like, you're such the face of attention. And as soon as that happens, the incentive shifts to, okay, here's this like company that must be crappy for some reason, and we're going to dig in and find out why. And it happens in every single company. And so you watch every company in Silicon Valley go through this wave of like, oh my gosh, it's the best thing ever. They're going to take over the world. Actually, they're not as bad as they speak. And oh my gosh, this is, the worst thing ever. And you kind of just ride those waves back and forth. But I'd never done that before, and I didn't realize that. And people told me that when we were on the way up. But I think one of my bigger mistakes was I didn't, and maybe you can't even fight this, but I didn't like dispel any of the hype when we didn't deserve it. And in my mind, it I don't want to say it didn't feel to me like we didn't deserve it. It was just like forward looking, right? Like, 10 years from now, we'll totally be doing X. But people were imagining that 3 months from now we'd be doing X, and then when we weren't doing X 3 months from now, everyone's like, oh my gosh, this, they're over-promising and under-delivering. I was like, wait, what? And then the downside of that got so vicious. And I never, the positive side was way more wild than I could have believed. And then the negative side was way more wild than I could have believed. And, I've been talking about this with some folks recently. I think because we kind of like, everybody feels very, very strongly about education and what it should be like. Everybody feels strongly about, what should be government run versus what should be private. And like, everybody feels really strongly about what is possible if you work really hard versus what is, impossible or difficult because of societal circumstances. And we're kind of like hitting all of those very sensitive points with a business model all at once. And so it's just like, I couldn't believe, like when everyone was giving us more credit than we deserve, I was like, okay, like that's, that's a little intense, but whatever, But then on the flip side of that, it was crazy. Like, and I'm sure it was because I was more sensitive to it than the other stuff, or you notice it way more. But I was not. It really screwed me up for the first time it happened. I'm talking like people sending me crazy stuff in the mail, creating Twitter accounts dedicated to just like I was really overweight then, and like people photoshopping weird stuff on fat people and being like, this is, it was like, I was like, what the hell? Like, what did I do to these people? And why is there so much vitriol? And so that really like, and I was like what am I doing that's causing this? What mistakes am I making? And I would try to like make the business better, which, it's not a bad instinct necessarily, but it took me a while to realize there's nothing you can do to prevent that. And at a certain point, you just need to get thick skin and get over it. And now it doesn't bother me at all. But yeah, that was crazy. You will see me defend people now that may not even necessarily need to be defended, because I'm like, I don't know what I could have done differently knowing what I knew. And we didn't make any, obviously we made a ton of mistakes, right? But none that I would have known to prevent at the time. Like, we were all just doing our best. And so it's crazy to see that level of hatred. But then you realize, I think Paul Graham was really the one that was like, hey, look, think about, and he wrote an essay about this. And he's seen this happen not just with us, but with all sorts of founders. Like, you become the belle of the ball in Silicon Valley, and then the incentive to rip you down is really high. And everybody's kind of like, they're so overrated. So, the analogy he uses, think about Taylor Swift, right? How there are people that absolutely cannot stand Taylor Swift. Why is that? Well, it's because some people just love Taylor Swift and, can't get enough of Taylor Swift. So imagine being Taylor Swift. You're like, dude, I'm just singing songs. I don't know. Why does everybody hate me so much? Right? Yeah. I think that helps. And then the tricky thing for us is if people come to us looking at us as their one shot in life, and we're successful 99% of the time, that 1% really, really sucks. And we try as hard as we possibly can to prevent that. But it's also, it's unavoidable. And so we have to own that or accept that as well. We're going to try to make it zero as much as we can. But, you can't name, if you were to go to a random university and ask 100 people how they felt about that university, it's not going to be 100 people saying, yeah, it's the best thing ever. Mm-hmm. And then when you're at that point in the press where everything is good, if you can find that one person who's really frustrated, then there's a story that's going to get clicks all day, and you'll always be able to find a frustrated student. You will always, and there's literally nothing I can do to stop that. So as long as we're a company about which there will be buzz and clicks if you say something bad, there will always be negative stories. And so we just kind of have to accept that. And it's just a way of life. Mm-hmm. And yeah, I have much thicker skin now. And it also helped for me to understand, the people who are attacking us are often very earnest, right? They're trying to protect people from getting hurt, and they believe that the current status quo would be sufficient enough to stop people from getting hurt. And while I may not agree with, I'm like, yeah, if we're bad, then what's the replacement? And if the replacement is the status quo, then that's even worse. But yeah, I think most people outside of a few entrenched industry people who are just on the payroll of big university money are earnest in trying to help people out, and you can't fault them for doing that, so mm-hmm. It is what it is.
Yeah, it sounds like it was a growing journey for you of realizing, okay, this is now my new reality, and then just growing thicker skin. And it sounds like now just developing, I hate to use the word empathy because it's so widely used, but empathy for them. With that, I heard you in an interview talk about yourself as you're like a duck on water, where you're pretty calm up front, and then there's a lot going on underneath the surface. How do you stay, what are some habits or just some things you do to stay relaxed? Is it meditation? Is it working out? Do you just do you journal? What do you do to deal with that?
I don't know if I'm the ideal person to speak to this, because I'm just very comfortable in chaotic environments. But I have like I've become pretty extremely minimalist. Like I don't do well with a lot of distractions. So if you go to, if you go to my house, I have as few belongings. I like, and it's a physical, like, the space that I am in. So I built a like office, gym thing, and that's where I work out of. But it's very, very simple. I mean, if you look at my phone as an example, like my home screen is literally just Kindle, Audible, and my calendar. Because if I have more than that, then
It's too much.
yeah, it like stresses me out. And I'm that way with clothing. I'm that way with like, I can't have any notifications on anything. So I guess for me, a lot of it is I try to keep a very simple lifestyle, very, very simple surroundings. And yeah, that's just like, that's become part of who I am, actually. Like I identify with, I think minimalism, speaking about press cycles, it's kind of coming back down from it being overhyped, as a process. But yeah, I probably should meditate more. I don't. I read a lot. I don't know.
Okay. No, that's hey, everyone has their own thing. It sounds like for you, it's keeping it simple, keeping it minimal, and then reading and
Yeah, I mean, my entire life is literally, I wake up, I hang out with the kids for a little bit, I work, I hang out with the family, I go. I literally don't do anything else. And so, and I strive to do very few things and do those things very, very well. So, yeah.
Sounds like wisdom. So what would you say, looking back, is, and we ask every guest this, what would you say is your best decision ever? And it can be within your career, it could just be in general life, however you want to take this. What would you say has been your best decision ever?
Asking my wife to marry me.
Okay, and what makes you say that?
Because I can run a mental simulation of what my life would be like without her.
Mm-hmm.
So, and she is a very private person, so I don't like, she would be frustrated if her face were ever on my like Twitter, as an example. But she grew up in a very small town on a farm, and she's very, very grounded, very level-headed. One of the reasons we got along, actually, is because of like our love for simplicity.
Mm-hmm.
She knows exactly what she wants, and she knows that it's simple. And I am a little more crazy. Like she wants to raise a really happy, healthy family the same way her parents raised her, and that's it. That's all she cares about. And so, for me, it's like, oh, do we, how much money do we make? There's a $1 billion company are going to change millions of lives. And she's like,
how do you balance that?
I think we've gotten to the point where she's kind of like, yeah, I recognize that that's important to you. And, she doesn't care. Like she would be just fine if I were a hay farmer, just like her dad was. Mm-hmm. And I've actually made more money investing in startups than I have from like just out of sheer luck. But like she doesn't like I haven't talked about this very often publicly, but like I was engaged to her before I went to live in the car, and she was really like, a lot of our engagement I spent living in a car, like in a different state. And she was very encouraging of that. And she's like, look, I know it's what you want. It's, you do what you have to do. And then, there's, when you're in college, there's that like, oh, well, what will people think of me? It's like, she doesn't care about that one bit. So for me, it's really good to have her around because she is so level-headed, so down to earth that like, after my first company failed, I was like, oh my gosh, this is like the worst thing ever. And she was like, yeah, we still got our family. Like, who cares? And I definitely didn't feel that way. And then when you raise a giant round of funding or you're hitting revenue milestones, she's like, yeah, that's good. Like, whatever. You gonna come to your daughter's soccer game tonight? Like, that's, and that groundedness is something that I really need, because if it were just me, I would not be grounded at all. And so that's been really healthy.
Okay. That was an awesome answer. I appreciate your honesty. It just sounds like she gives you some groundedness. So before we ask the final question, where can people find you, learn more about Bloom Tech?
Yeah, bloomtech.com. I'm Austin on Twitter, AUSTEN. Gave up my verification when I saw that come available, so I switched my username and you lose the verification. But what can you do? Yeah.
Sorry about that.
It's all right. I hope Elon takes it over, so that I think he'll give me verification. But he doesn't know who I am. It seems vaguely more likely that I'll get it back. Yeah.
Fingers crossed.
Yeah.
The final question, what advice would you give to someone that is on the other side of a big decision? Maybe they want to move across country, live in their car, to go and start a company, or maybe they want to go and change jobs. What advice would you give to someone considering a big decision?
Yeah, I think Jeff Bezos had the mental model that he shared about the regret minimalization framework, and that one. So the idea behind that is, what will I wish I would have done when I'm 80? Mm-hmm. And I've also heard somebody say like, yeah, I want the 8-year-old me and the 80-year-old me to both like be really proud of who I am. Mm-hmm. And for me, that generally mean like, if you're asking that question, oftentimes that means there's something that you want to do, but you're a little bit afraid to do it. Mm-hmm. And even if it ends up in total failure, I've never regretted trying it out and at least knowing. I mean, yeah, if it's like, don't play Russian roulette because you think it's exciting, but if it's, go try something new, go try it. The other thing that I think people drastically overestimate is how risky things actually are. And I thought about this when we were first starting what was then Lambda School, now Bloom Tech. Like, worst case scenario, if we would have failed, I could have been back in a very similar job a year later. And like, usually the worst case scenario is you just go right back to where you are now. And it's not anything to be afraid of. So I guess in similar vein of thinking about the downside risk is usually not that bad. And when I dropped out of college, that was my approach. It's like, well, I'll give it a few months. And like, and my family lost it when I dropped out. They were not very happy about that. I mean, my wife was like a first generation college graduate, and all of her family was very excited. Three of my 4 grandparents are teachers and conservative, and like I think 3 of the 4, my grandpa didn't graduate from college, but both of my grandmas, my other grandpa did, and they were both the first who had the chance to go to college and thought it was the absolute best thing in the world, right? It was an opportunity that their parents didn't have. And none of the past generations had. And so they felt like I was just spitting in the face of this incredible gift that I'd been given by virtue of having, my parents, my grandparents get an education. And like, my family was kind of moving into the middle class for the first time in history, and they're like, you're going to throw that all away? And I was like, look, if I go do this and nothing's happened a year later, I can just go back. Like, it's not a one-way street. You can just, I was already like 21, and I started my college career as a junior because I had so many AP credits. I was like, I only have 2 years of school to do. I already did a semester. So I've got like a year and a half left, and they're like, just finish. It's so close. I was like, no, I feel really compelled to do something right now. And I promise you, if it doesn't work out, I'll be back. And then my older brother ended up doing the same thing. And he's now, his company was acquired. He's super successful. He never asked to work again. And he married his wife is a family of doctors, and they couldn't even fathom that there would be a career path if you didn't go to college. And so, funnily enough, in my family, how much money you've made is inversely correlated with how much college you went to. I'm sure that won't be the case in the long run, but I think it was the right thing for me. And it took a while for my family to come around to that. And one of the reasons I felt confident in doing it is knowing that it wasn't a one-way street. I could have gone back if I ever felt. I could go back right now if I wanted to. I could be a college graduate in probably 18 months. There's just no reason to. I think my older brother is like 6 credits away, or 3. He's like literally 1 class or 2 classes away from graduating, which is like, I just don't care. Why would I, So yeah, realize that almost every decision is a two-way street. Maybe there's something like getting married or having kids where you want to be extra sure.
That'd be important.
But yeah, if you're thinking about moving cross country, like, yeah, move cross country. And if it sucks, like, get on a Greyhound. It's $100 and you'll be home. Who cares?
I love it. Austin, thank you. Guys, rehearse the worst case. Trust your gut. Go for it. Do not live with regrets. You've heard it here. Thank you so much for watching. I'll talk to you soon.